Can you all hear me? Okay. Bon dia, buenos tardes, dobre dan. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. My name is Michelle Raheja. I'm a professor at the University of California, Riverside in the Department of English. I'm the former director of the California Center for Native Nations, and I'm a Seneca descendant, and our homelands are from New York and Pennsylvania. Muchas gracias for attending my talk today, and hvala vam, especially to Dr. Bojana Petrovic and the other conference organizers, and to my dear friend, Dr. Alexandra Izarjian, for making it possible for me to give talks in Novi Sad. And also a shout out to Milosevic, who's my new friend from Serbia. And I apologize in advance that my paper will be in English and not in Serbian or Spanish or Portuguese. Throughout this presentation, I use Indigenous and Native American interchangeably to refer to the first peoples of the Americas, although Native American typically refers to the peoples of what is now known as the US. I begin this talk with a quote from Laguna Pueblo author Leslie Marmon Soko to foreground the importance of photography to Native American communities in the borderlands between Mexico and the United States. Quote, "Photographs have special significance with the people of my family and the people at Laguna. A photograph is serious business, and many people still do not trust just anyone to take their picture." I put pressure on the phrase, "a photograph is serious business," to emphasize the vital nature of visual sovereignty to Indigenous people and to highlight narrative photography's potentially dangerous, liberating, and critical elements. Soko's family has a complex relationship to photography that mirrors that of many Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. On the one hand, photography could, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, be perilous in the hands of reservation agents and the government. Yet on the other, Native American photographers, such as Soko's father, who was trained while in the military in the 1940s, have provided intimate, important links to family histories through their artwork, which functions as what Roland Barthes calls a certificate of presence. Beginning with a history of Indigenous photographic representations, this talk is a work in progress that considers how two Indigenous women photographers, Citlali Fabian from Mexico City and Cara Romero from the US, invest in Native American futurity through their visual work in order to overturn negative, time-worn stereotypes and replace them with contemporary, self-generated visual portrayals. In this presentation, I seek to uplift and amplify these images through an engagement with theories of Indigenous futurity and what Tuscarora artist and scholar Jolene Rickard first termed visual sovereignty. I draw from Rickard's work to define visual sovereignty as, quote, "the creative self-representation of Native American visual artists," end of quote, as a weapon against the visual tyranny of settler colonialism. Through an analysis of the work of these two photographers, with an emphasis on the importance of corn or maíz, I aim to engage in an ethical conversation with you and with Fabian and Romero, placing them in their historical context and forwarding a close reading of their work. While a conversation with them is not possible at this time, although I intend to interview both of them as part of the published work, I hope to do so as I edit this talk for submission. I would like to employ the gold standard of academic knowledge production, publications, and public presentations to begin this conversation, despite the damage that institutions of higher education have inflicted on Indigenous communities throughout the Americas. In this conversation with you today, I propose examining both the historic photographic tradition alongside the work of these two award-winning contemporary artists. Fabian and Romero, alongside other Indigenous photographers, invest in theories of futurity to combat the negative archive of images produced under the settler colonial regime and held in institutions such as university and museum collections. Not only do they invite the reader to reevaluate the inaccurate assemblages of Indigenous visual representations, but the work by contemporary photographers is also produced for Native American communities who collect, find meaning in, and are inspired by this visually sovereign art form through narrative activism. Drawing from theories of Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurity was first coined by Grace Dillon to refer to Native American speculative fiction and its projection of Indigenous life past the ruins of the myths of the vanishing Indian. Lilia McEnany defines Indigenous futurisms as a theory and practice that, quote, engages with capitalism, environmental collapse, and resource extraction, among the many other structures that accompany the ongoing disaster of colonization, that generate new ideological, visual, and spatial possibilities, end of quote. It is also a means of rematriation, which is an indigenous term that recaptures the idea of repatriation, which is a sort of heteropatriarchal term to kind of develop it for a feminist idea of rematriation. Returning archival artifacts such as those in museums and a participation in the #LandBack movement to Indigenous communities. As a methodology, futurity and its praxis decolonizes settler knowledge production and replaces it with Indigenous joy, positive self-representation, pleasure, decolonizing gestures, and realities. Prior to a close analysis of Fabian and Romero's work and their engagement with futurity, it's important to start with the past. I'll describe the historical foundations of both settler and early Indigenous photography, which have their origins in anthropology, military surveillance, and other colonial systems. Photographs of Indigenous peoples, perhaps more so than any visual or narrative form, have been ubiquitous since the advent of photographic technology and have profoundly affected the ways Native communities have been represented. Yes. Oh, did you have your hand up? Hi. Continue to be imagined. Dakota scholar Vine Deloria has critiqued the medium as one of the most damaging genres to Indigenous peoples in the sense that it is both cataloged atrocities committed against Native communities and individuals through its hyper-visible technologies and erased Indigenous presence through narratives of the vanishing Indian. And these are sort of the quintessential images of Native people by the photographer, the settler photographer, Edward Curtis, which are famous. They're produced on postcards and on calendars and kind of exemplify what Native people were like in the 19th and early 20th centuries, although it was a fictive version of Native people. And here I apologize for not including more images taken by Indigenous Mexican and Latin American photographers. I couldn't find many online, so if I leave out any photographers from Mexico and elsewhere, I apologize and hope you'll draw them to my attention. Some of the earliest photographic technologies by Indigenous people in what is now known as Mexico and the United States were shot by commercial and amateur photographers and government agents. Daguerreotypes and gelatin silver prints of important historical figures, such as the Indigenous Mexican President Benito Juarez and the Sauk leader Keokuk, were created as early as 1843. And this is one of the only surviving photographs from that time period. So it's a really early image of a Native American leader who resisted American colonization in the early 19th century. Just 4 years after early photographic technologies were invented, images such as those created by Curtis and Easterly due to their exploitative nature that were meant to place Indigenous people in the position of a vanishing, inevitably doomed, and inferior race. They documented the lives of people struggling to survive under the harsh conditions of settler colonialism. Yet they are also complicated visual art forms, sometimes opening up aporia, as Jacques Derrida would say, or gaps in the historical record, in capturing instances of power, resistance, and intact cultural practices which operate as love letters to the future. And I think the images of Benito Juarez in particular operate as a love letter to the future. They offer up images of unexpected Indigenous peoples in unexpected places to play with Dakota scholar Philip Deloria's foundational work that charts how Native people have occupied positions of prominence and power in the face of great adversity. They also document moments of what otherwise Native people would be seen as negative or vanishing images. And I really love this image because it shows a Native American family in this sort of moment of intimate joy surrounded by this child, and they're smiling back at the camera, which makes it a really rare image. And the same with this image of a young girl in the 19th century in a boarding school who's also smiling back at the camera, which is another exceedingly rare image where Native people are usually seen as stoic or unsmiling or very serious, and in this one, she's reflecting this sort of notion of joy. They also record the lives of people, important people, however unintentionally. And these are photographs of two-spirit people who fulfill the roles of traditional third gender, especially through service to the community, including sacred obligations, leadership positions, and warfare functions, and they're remarkable in many senses, especially since they document people who were important to and protected by their communities. And the image on your left is of Wawe, who was a Zuni transgender person who was highly respected in her tribe and traveled to traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Grover Cleveland. This is a really important figure. The figures in the left include Oshtish, who was Apsaloke, and was married to a Native American man. And then on the right-hand side is Dashteste, who was part of Geronimo's band and fought against both Mexican colonization as well as American colonization. And then this image, which is also incredibly rare, that a friend of mine who's Mojave drew to my attention, is Sahawkwisa, who was a respected healer, prosperous farmer, and hunter. And she had many, they had many wives and partners within the community. They had their face tattooed, which is a sign of prominence and respect. And then this is a really rare image. While the anthropologic gaze rendered them aberrant, and the United States obviously would see third gender people as aberrant or strange and also subject to certain kinds of laws, these images demonstrate resistance and love letters to the future as well. Unlike the settler archive, the medium of photography in Indigenous hands has been a powerful means of producing self-representational narratives and tools of decolonization, even while photographs of Native people continue to be utilized to destroy and contain. Sometimes these images were captured by settlers sympathetic to Indigenous peoples, and at other times by Indigenous peoples themselves. These photographs record both Native resilience in the face of colonization and document resistance and counter-narratives. There were also a growing number of early and mid-20th century Indigenous photographers who were tireless in their work to overcome the previous century's stereotypical images and who were also invested in futurity in their work. And this is the first Native American photographer from the United States. I don't know, and I apologize for not knowing about who the first Indigenous female Latin American photographer was. But Jenny Ross Cobb, who was Cherokee, documented Indigenous people in sort of everyday quotidian practices, like Here you'll see bathers in the Illinois River in Oklahoma around 1896. She photographed a lot of Indigenous people outside, so not in a photographic studio, and they're doing sort of everyday kinds of activities. And then take also, for example, Martín Chambi, an Inca commercial portrait photographer from Peru, who documented Indigenous life in the 1920s and 1930s from an insider's perspective. In 1936, after exhibiting his work in perhaps the first show by an Indigenous photographer and perhaps the first show by any Native artist in the Americas, Chambi noted, quote, "It is believed that Indigenous peoples have no culture, that they are barbarians. That is why I am undertaking this task," end of quote. According to the Museum of Modern Art in the US, quote, "It was through his extensive photographic records, publications, and postcard productions that he radically changed perceptions of the region, leaving an indelible mark on Peruvian visual culture," end of quote. Like other Indigenous photographers, Chambi uses the technology to create a self-contained economy of visual sovereignty. In his self-portrait, he holds up a negative of himself, thus insisting on a different set of looking relations that privileges the Indigenous gaze. Chambi looks at his photographs, and his self-portrait gazes back at him, demonstrating the power of Indigenous looking relations that refuse settler scopophilia. And this is sort of a visual economy of him looking at himself and then reflecting back on himself and not being particularly concerned with the photographer who's taking this image. The viewer might have access to Chambi's self-portrait, but he's invested in the futurity inherent in the version of himself where the subject of the photograph is gazing back at himself in an endless cycle. The photographic negative is a totalizing image in which the darkened parts of the photograph are made light and vice versa. In other images, Chambi's subjects are shown in intimate poses. In the first, a farming family sits atop their harvest, with two seated male figures in the front smiling back at the photographer. And in some cases, the rare images of Native people smiling back at the photographer are a display of sort of power and recapturing their sovereignty. And then in others, it's the sense of intimacy with the photographer, and they're smiling back in sort of a warm and intimate way. Using Leslie Marmon Soko's admonition that photographs can be dangerous, it's clear that these images reflect back the pride of their harvest rather than a complicity and wariness with settler anthropology. The last photograph that I use of the thousands of photographs that Chambi took during his lifetime, this image also reflects the intimacy with the subject smiling back at the photographer. This warm smile demonstrates the trust the Incan man has of Chambi, but also the dignity of his subject. Another Indigenous photographer, Horace Pulau, who was Kiowa, creates intimate, informal, and surprising images of his subjects, as you can see from this photograph of a car as well as a military family. He reverses this settler dictum that photographs of Indigenous people were meant to document a primitive or anachronistic vanishing race. And you see this sort of outdoor photos like the images that Ross took, and also sort of counteracting this idea that Native American people were without technology, that they weren't living in the present moment. Likewise, Peter Pitsiolak, an Inuit photographer from northern Canada, released his first photographs in the 1940s in collaboration with his wife, Agio Pitsiolak, and she's also in the image. And you see here that he's using his photographic technology in the image, so someone's taking his photograph and then he has the technology in the space to show that Inuit people weren't primitive or outside of time. Hundreds of their photographs, produced primarily for an Inuit audience in their community, radically reframed Arctic peoples in scenes of hunting, Inuit relationships with more than human animals, and intimate, joyful family settings meant solely for Inuit consumption and circulation. According to Jonathan Wise, quote, Pitsiolek's photographs become complex configurations of self-identity, confronting models of representation as they disrupt a relationship between observer and viewer, end of quote. Like Martin Chamby and other Indigenous photographers of the time, Pitsiolek engaged in visual sovereignty to combat and counteract negative representations and to foster images and practices of futurity through imagining time beyond the apocalypse of settler history. Like other Indigenous photographers, he also employs self-portraits with his equipment as a form of visual sovereignty aimed at interrupting the settler gaze to show an investment in the future, in the present and the future. Now I'd like to shift the conversation. This is another Tsimshian photographer in his studio space. Now I'd like to shift the conversation back to the work of two contemporary Indigenous women photographers, Citlali Fabian, a Zapotec artist from Mexico City and Oaxaca, and Cara Romero, a Chemehuevi artist from Southern California who currently lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Fabian is an award-winning National Geographic portrait photographer based in the United Kingdom, whose subjects are typically Indigenous women from her community and who has documented some of the more than 150,000 mostly Indigenous citizens and migrants from Oaxaca who moved to Los Angeles in the 20th and 21st centuries, and who are currently living under a situation of terror in the United States. I live outside of Los Angeles, and there are ICE agents everywhere picking up people from anybody who they think looks like they're from Latin America and then holding them in conditions of absolute barbarity. So she's also taking photographs of these people in order to show sort of an investment in futurity, but also in resistance to the current United States regime. She learned the craft from her father, a commercial photographer, and later at university. She calls herself a visual storyteller and conceives of her investment in Indigenous futurity as a ritual. She has also stated in interviews that the purpose of her art is to ensure future generations look at us and our approach to this in this particular time and space. Most of Fabian's images are in black and white, which I contend demonstrate her commitment to engaging with the complicated history of 19th century photography, such as you've seen in some of the previous slides. The technology that she uses often has its origin in early photographic technologies, including wet plate collodion and Polaroids, making her portraits of her primarily women subjects arresting and intimate. Her subjects channel the defiant and resistant gazes of their 19th century ancestors, looking back at the spectator to disrupt the colonial gaze. The close-up portraits of these subjects force the viewer to confront their own spectatorial practices and the long arc of traffic in the settler visual economy. For example, this photograph taken of a young woman in a sugarcane field not only gazes directly at the settler with a wry smile, so again, this sort of idea of smiling back at the photographer, but she also wields a machete, thus subverting Laura Mulvey's gendered theory of the gaze, wherein women are looked at while they look away passively and thus become visually consumed by the presumably male and settler viewer. The unnamed subject of this gaze draws attention to the thousands of unsolved cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and people throughout the Americas by reclaiming visual power and memory. And for those of you who don't know, there are thousands of Indigenous people who have either disappeared or who have been murdered throughout the Americas, although in the United States we know mostly about the ones who have been taken and murdered in Canada and in the United States. And this is a huge kind of issue or an epidemic that faces Indigenous people. And there are very few cases where their murders have been solved, since these are people who don't really count as human, especially in the United States and Canada. She is also wielding a weapon in the image, demonstrating that while Soko, Deloria, and others make claims for the danger of photography to Indigenous communities, she shows how these images can also be weaponized against the settler audience. She does so through defiantly laying bare the possibility that the machete can cut through and wound the settler gaze. It's both protective and threatening. Fabienne also collaborates with her community members to create images of collective memory that are from, by, and for Zapotec women through references to continuous, unbroken cultural continuity. Most significantly, the women in her photographs often feature a halo of corn husks, the primary staple in the diets of Indigenous peoples throughout time immemorial, throughout Mexico and parts of what is now known as the United States. Some Zapotec communities in Oaxaca are matriarchal and/or matrifocal, and much of this can be attributed to the cultivation, importance, and sacredness of corn. Although the Zapotec corn god is male, women play critical roles in all the stages of maize production, including religious ones, through gender complementarity. Women are also at the forefront of social justice struggles to protect their cornfields and community livelihoods from threats such as climate change and extractive projects like mining throughout the country. While being separated from the Zapotec geographically, Mayans postulated that humans were first created by and from corn, a powerful cosmological symbol of the origin of humanity. This creation story may have also influenced the Zapotec, as Fabienne's portraits can be read as feminist rematriation through her alignment of Zapotec women as corn ears, the edible and most vital parts of the crop. The women and girls in Fabienne's portraits can be interpreted through their placement within the husks as corn themselves, and thus the photographs signal both resistance to the visual economies of settler photography and simultaneously are at the heart of Indigenous Mexican culture through their placement as corn. The corn also resembles a halo around a subject, implicitly referencing image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who reportedly appeared to an Indigenous man in the 16th century and who has become an icon for the Virgin Mary and patriarchal images of female purity and piety throughout Mexico. For centuries, Mexican women have been represented as one of two figures, the chaste Virgin of Guadalupe with her halo, or the putatively sexually lascivious La Malinche, an Indigenous woman trafficked by Spanish conquistadors who served as Hernán Cortez's interpreter in the 16th century. Fabienne provides a third feminist reading of this oppressive dichotomy through her subject's bold gaze back at the audience and halo of corn husks. By placing Zapotec women at the center of her images, she opens up space for Indigenous self-representation, and that thus points to a futurity not bound by settler gendered visual culture. She also blurs the boundaries between human beings and the more than human as a futurity that draws from the past by sort of placing them in this close proximity to the more than human product of corn. Cara Romero's body of work is likewise invested in self-consciously creating images that engage with Indigenous futurity. However, her photographs are more speculative in nature and are shot predominantly in color using a digital camera. Yet both photographers achieve similar ends. Like Fabienne, Romero is a well-known award-winning artist who documents primarily Southern California Indigenous people in both Los Angeles and in the Coachella Valley, an hour from Los Angeles. So take, for example, her image of billboards featuring young Indigenous people against the backdrop of the Coachella Valley. So In the United States, there are these sort of national parks or landscapes that have been completely robbed of their indigenous presence. They're sort of seen as spaces that are uninhabitable and uninhabited, that they have no history. And by using the billboards, instead of being advertisements for products, they're images of visual sovereignty that reflects back and draws attention to indigenous presence in these spaces. And then there's another image called TV Indians, which shows a family on the land surrounded by both the visual technologies of the TV and family portraits. And the television has been particularly important to indigenous communities throughout the Americas because it reflects back these mostly negative images in telenovelas, in Western films in the 1950s and 60s. So this image kind of overturns that to show that indigenous people have the technology of television, but instead of portraying these negative images, they're substituting them with more positive images. Rather than focusing on the past, Romero reimagines her subjects engaged in new traditional and contemporary practices that draw from wisdom that's tens of thousands of years old. Her work features Native Americans in unexpected places doing unexpected things. On Instagram, she notes that, quote, as an indigenous photographer, I embrace photography as a tool to resist Eurocentric narratives and as a means for opening audiences' perspectives to contemporary Native American lives. This can be seen in Romero's powerful photograph called Three Sisters, part of her new Indigenous Futurisms collection, which features three stylish, intricately tattooed women wearing sunglasses, sitting on a cloud with the universe behind them. Three Sisters references the traditional Haudenosaunee sky woman human origin narrative, and this isn't a narrative, since my family is Haudenosaunee, that I've heard my whole life, and it's a really important creation story. And because it's an oral narrative, it changes over time to kind of adapt to more contemporary ways of being and living. And so this narrative, in which the first human being falls from the world above and lands on a turtle's back, becomes Earth, with the help of a muskrat who brings soil to Sky Woman from far beneath the ocean. She creates Earth by placing the mud on the turtle's back. She brings life to the world by planting seeds she has stowed in her pocket on her fall from the sky world to what's now known as the Earth, corn, beans, and squash, which are called the Three Sisters because they grow together harmoniously and sustainably through traditional ecological knowledge practices, thus nurturing the human beings Sky Woman would later bring forth. The three women in the photograph personify the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, to show interrelatedness and reciprocity. The women are also bathed in blue light, which symbolizes dawn, the first light of morning, and the color of light formed by digital devices and screens, placing emphasis on indigenous futurity, perhaps even virtual reality, as the sunglasses the women wear could also symbolize the promise of the future. And they look a little bit like virtual reality sunglasses. They embrace technology as indigenous peoples have always embraced new and useful technologies. And since the beginning of time, indigenous people have always embraced new technologies. As they travel through space, you can see that the cultivation of corn, which started in Mexico, is also grown in parts of what's now known as the United States. And also you can see parrot feathers. So there were these sort of networks of trade in important goods throughout the Americas. Romero's Three Sisters represents a contemporary feminist matriarchal take on this creation story that's already a creation story, since it's a narrative about people being created in this world from a woman, from a female deity. Tethered to the cosmos and each other through wires, and the images blend the timeless oral narrative to not only the present, but the future, marked by the promise of the center figure's pregnant belly. Quote, from a very young age, end of quote, Romero has stated in an interview, quote, Chemehuevi women are taught that their innate strength as a woman and life giver is all-powerful, maybe sometimes even supernatural, and we are respected as equals in Chemehuevi society. We hold power in government and historically in battle. This unique perspective shows up throughout my art, end of quote. Unlike settler culture, which is predicated on heteropatriarchy and Christianity, many, if not most, traditional indigenous nations honor women and perceive of women's voices as complementary and as equal as men's. The zenith, like Fabian's black and white photographs and Romero's Three Sisters, also demonstrates an investment in futurity. The title of the image, Zenith, refers to the time at which something is most powerful or successful, the high point which describes how people, planets, and stars reach their pinnacle. The subject is an astronaut, hinting at the powerful ways in which indigenous people understand and travel the galaxy through narrative. And there's a real sense that indigenous people have always understood time, not only time as circular, but time as teleological. Like indigenous people knew what dinosaurs were. They've also traveled through space and time through narrative and sort of understand the universe and different sort of sense of time dimension as contemporary settler physicists understand time. So it sort of precedes that notion of physics and time that's demonstrated in contemporary knowledge practices. The astronaut connected to both the past through his antiquated flight suit and travel through space with corn. And again, this sort of image of the importance of corn. That vital food source, and the future through his presence in space, also referencing the present. His helmet visor reflects back an image of Romero's studio, like the images of indigenous photographers who mark their presence and power through investments in technology that overturn stereotypes. And so in earlier slides, you saw images of indigenous photographers with their studio equipment next to them. And here, the visor of the astronaut reflects back Romero's studio, which I think is kind of an in-joke. To return to Silko's epigraph at the beginning of this presentation, photography has historically been a means of capturing dangerous snapshots of indigenous people doomed to the ethnographic past. But it is also a vital means of showing visual sovereignty through smiling, intimate portraits of indigenous community members. I would add that these photographs, both the historical and present-day ones, invest in futurity through their visual genealogies that hold forth the promise of continuity and innovation, using the past to imagine an ongoing imagined future. And I'm going to stop here since so many of you seem really warm in this room. But I want to say mucho gracias for being here, valavam, for coming to my talk, and naiwe, in my language, naiwe skeno means thank you, but also hello. So thank you. I guess if anybody has any questions, you could ask now or come see me after the talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a small present
Oh,
for
thank you.
This is a wine from this region.
Oh,
so,
perfect. Thank
small
you.
present from the touristic agency of Novi Sad.
Uh-huh.
I had another one for you, and maybe the other bag with some small things from the Congress. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Michelle.
much. I really appreciate it.
It was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, if you don't have any questions, I hope you enjoy the rest of today and your time in Novi Sad.